Session 3. We can talk about knitting. I particularly like these two portraits on either side of the Defarges, and we can begin to see how they are developing more so. I think we'll talk about Jacques, though, and its meaning, historically speaking, next week. So here we go. So we brought the, why is this not there? Do you all see what I'm seeing? Do you just see my screen? Or do you see this obnoxious thing at the top above my screen?
No,
there's nothing but your slide on.
Okay, so it's just me then. Good. Okay. I don't know why that.
It looks very, it looks like there's a paper cover over it.
Yeah.
Which,
a paper cover.
yeah,
No, it looks fine.
You can
Okay.
barely see it, but yeah.
Well, well, that's
print out stuff on it.
It's my effect. So okay.
Yes.
So we talked about the condition of England question a little bit last week, and we need to re-emphasize that this week. And it's an important debate in the Victorian era over the issue of the English working class during the Industrial Revolution. The division of society and the poverty of the majority began to dominate the minds of the intelligentsia following the 1832 Reform Act, which we talked about, which begins to give the right to vote to some of the middle class. And that will be increased with two other Reform Acts in the future. Dickens was a condition of England novelist who wrote in 1859, "It was a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled." That's from his novel Hard Times, which is a powerful evocation of the impact of the Industrial Revolution on England. So we've talked about the French Revolution and in all its phases. And now we need to understand to what degree, if any, it impacted Great Britain. So in the background is a George Cruikshank cartoon, and that cartoon portrays what was known in 1819 as the Peterloo Massacre. And the Peterloo Massacre took place in Manchester, which is north of London, and was really the beginning of the heartland of industry for England and Great Britain. So there was a heavy predominance of working class living up there, obviously to man the factories. One recent historian called it, the Peterloo Massacre, the bloodiest political event in 19th century English history. And of course, Peterloo here it was held at Peterloo Fields, Peter Fields. And Peterloo is a reference to Waterloo. And that was a prediction of what impact this event might have on Great Britain, although it didn't really become the Waterloo for the working class in any way, shape, or form. Over 60,000 people were at this protest. It was peaceful. There were speakers on a raised platform. Over 400 to 600 were injured, and 18 people died. In 1830, there were revolutions that coursed throughout the continent of Europe, beginning in France, once again, and spreading throughout, demanding what became referenced as liberal reform. So let's identify here quickly the term liberal and conservative, because in the 19th century, they take on different forms. So a conservative was one who believed in upholding the traditions of English history. And so they believed in monarchy, the church, which in this case was the Anglican Church, and aristocracy. And a conservative did not believe that those powers should be diminished, and that if they were, bad things would happen to Great Britain. So a liberal was one who believed that the power of the church, the power of the monarch, and the power of the aristocracy should be held in some check, and some of their authority should be reduced. And overall, this becomes the liberal becomes the viewpoint of the middle class that's evolving, unless you're talking about the lowest portions of the middle class, and then they would fall into the third category that I'll talk about in a minute. They want the constitutional monarchy. They believe they have a constitution, and that it should be more strictly enforced. So anyway, these ideals were racking across Europe all the way to Russia and all the way to northern France, lapping at the waters of the English Channel. And there were British powers that were worried that it would cross the channel. So there is no doubt that the 1832 Reform Act, which did increase for the first time males who owned a little bit of property, the right to vote, and this would begin to change the House of Commons to some degree. And it certainly helped to dissuade violent revolution for some in Great Britain. Then in 1838, and I mentioned this group before, and I'll mention them again here, the Chartists wrote up the document called the People's Charter, and of the many demands, they wanted a further expansion of the vote. So there's that agitation, but they're not calling for violent revolution by any means. Then in 1848, there's another round of violent revolutions on the continent, again, starting in France and going all the way to Russia, and demanding the very same things, because the liberal reforms that were given lip service in the 1830 revolutions to quell the violence never were enforced. And so once again, there's the demand for this change. And what's happened here is the Industrial Revolution, which begins in Great Britain, of course, has spread to the continent. And there is a growing working class population, and they are certainly a catalyst. But they're willing to take to the streets, unlike the working class, for the most part, in Great Britain. So that I've just gone over the political ideology. Here's another Cruikshank cartoon. This is his portrayal of a freeborn Englishman, with, of course, his lips sealed with a padlock. So Cruikshank was very skeptical of the conservative point of view, and this was in 1819. So the third point of view, for our purposes, is the radical. And what does a radical stand for at that time? There's about 6 of them, but the main ones for the British were universal suffrage. Now, there was some division here. For some, this meant universal manhood suffrage, but for some, it would include women. The secret ballot. It was very easy to find out how you voted, and you could influence people. If they knew how you voted, they could bribe you, buy you pints at the local pub, etc. So they wanted the secret ballot. This was known actually as the Australian ballot, because the Australians will adopt the ballot first as a secret ballot. And then they want all MPs, members of parliament, to be paid, because up to that time and beyond, if you're going to be a member of parliament, you don't get paid, so you have to have an income. Well, that's going to right there change the kind of people who can run for office in the House of Commons. So by paying them, you could bring in other people who are not self-sufficient financially speaking. Conservatives and liberals of Great Britain remembered the terror. Class remained a significant force in politics, and really you could probably say remained the significant force on politics. Even if you're a radical, you were conscious of your class, and it helps to define not only British politics, but European politics in general. And that's going to be a real big difference between Europe, Great Britain, and the United States. So Punch magazine, a political comic magazine, satire, published this cartoon as a result of the 1848 revolutions. Here's the great sea serpent of 1848. She's wearing the cap of liberty, and she's threatening this little boat that's full of European monarchs. So you take it from this cartoon with the sun rising in the back, that Punch is sympathetic to the radical cause, at least to some degree. I showed this, I believe, last time, but I wanted to show it again, because I just love the photograph. But the Chartists had kind of lost the wind in their sails by the end of the 1830s because they didn't get anywhere, and it wasn't really being their ideas weren't being picked up by the liberals, and radicals were far and few between in the House of Commons. But with the 48 revolutions, Chartism gets a second short-lived reemergence here as a result of the revolutions. And so I just remind you of that. And this is probably representative of St. Peter's Field and the rally that was held there, which was before photography. This time, though, there is no cavalry that's going to charge and break up this gathering. A painting from 1850. And it's a powerful evocation of the idea that the Reign of Terror, are now well past, since the Reign of Terror was in the 1790s. This was painted in the 1850s, and it was a very popular painting that traveled around a little bit and got some press. And it's called The Roll Call of the Last Victims of the Terror, because what happened during the Reign of Terror, the National Convention would gather its people that had been arrested and put them in a holding area, and then you were called one by one and taken to the tribunal, where it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that you were going to be found guilty, and then you would be put on the wagon and taken to la guillotine. It's a pretty powerful painting. Here's another Cruikshank cartoon of the guillotine. It's pretty graphic, somewhat pornographic. The monster of the guillotine. You can see a skull peeking through the hole where the head was placed before the blade came down, and the monster with the red revolutionary cap is chasing after English politicians who are notable conservatives. So why was there no violent revolution in Britain? Prevalent in 19th century thought in Great Britain was how the abstract idea of duty could become a concrete aim of society. In other words, that there would be politicians leaders who would speak to the idea of duty, and that it was a duty of each citizen to, support the society, however you define society at that time. Some historians believe that the rise of Methodism, which was taking place at this time quite successfully, and was never threatening the Anglican Church, but it was becoming popular to a small vocal intellectual group within Great Britain, had something to do with this, because the Methodism does talk about the duty to society. More likely, it was a combination of the following factors. The emerging middle class of voters was a tempering influence. The middle class is not looking to tear down society, because it's beginning to emerge as an influential factor. So they don't see any gain in picking up the pitchforks and the guns. Besides, the mob scares most middle class British voters. The British working class was clearly less radical, in part because the 1832 and 1867 reform bills gave them hope that things were changing and moving in the right direction. They might not be moving fast enough for them, but fast enough that they weren't willing, for the most part, to take a violent stand. There's also a much higher literacy rate in Great Britain than anywhere else in Europe. Therefore, that clearly had an impact, because people were reading newspapers and better informed, less exposed to conspiracy theories and all that. And I'm not going to say anything else about conspiracy theories. And lastly, and this is a big one, the expanding empire under Queen Victoria offered a lot of opportunity for middle class who may be disgruntled, but they could go to India and they could go to parts of Asia and elsewhere and get pretty good jobs and make a good living to support their family, and have a more important position than if they had stayed at home. So there is no doubt that the expanding empire was a social pressure valve for preventing disgruntlement to a greater degree in Great Britain at that time. So as a whole, you put these things together and they help to explain, in part at least, why there was no real taste for violent revolution in Britain. Historians look at change over time. It's an important tool, an important measure for historians to better understand what's going on in society. And Dickens, who travels to America, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a minute from Jenny, and he's very excited about what's taking place, he thinks in his mind, in the United States. But when he gets there, his eyes are opened and he sees things, and of course slavery is a big one, that really turn him off and make him begin to question whether or not America is all that it's cracked up to be. And he writes in American Notes, which was his travel log for his trip to the United States, "This is not the republic of my imagination, but a nation of self-interested grubbers who cared only for politics and money, pretending at liberty and equality while condoning slavery." Dickens had a traumatizing experience in America. He became less radical, less optimistic, and he downgraded his view of human nature, according to historian Jerome Meckier. So Dickens changes his tune a bit. Even though he's excited about French culture, he's concerned about the condition of England, he gets over to the United States and goes, if this is democracy, then maybe democracy is not what the Great Britain needs. Speaking of traveling to America, Jenny?
Yes. So I mentioned earlier about Eastern State Penitentiary and its influence on Dickens. And when he was in America, he visited Eastern State right in Philadelphia. And as you can see from his quote here, he said, "The system is rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement. And I believe its effects to be cruel and wrong." He also continued to write, "He is a man buried alive, to be dug out in the slow round of years." Doesn't that sound familiar? How many times we heard the buried alive during the course of A Tale of Two Cities? But he felt very strongly when he saw this that this was not the way. And you can see it this on the slide on the right there, what they called the eye of God, the window at the top that was supposed to cast light down on them to help inspire people to reform. But if you read all of his American notes about Eastern State, it's really scary. I mean, talk about a good Halloween tale. I mean, with the bags over their heads and their feet padded, it was pretty crazy. So in the section of the book we read, Dr. Minette has a relapse to his shoemaking in the chapter 9 Days, and then Laurie helps him to talk about his illness in the chapter An Opinion. There have been references throughout the book about his mental state, and I'm just going to reference a few of those to sort of remind us of what we've heard about. So when he was at the trial about the journey over from France for Charles Darnay, he said they asked him if he remembered about the journey, and he said, "None. My mind is a blank. From some time, I cannot even say what time, when I employed myself in my captivity in making shoes, to the time when I found myself living in London with my dear daughter here. She became familiar to me when a gracious God restored my abilities, but I am quite unable even to say how she had become familiar. I have no remembrance of the process." And then Pross and Laurie, as comes back up in these chapters we read, but earlier in the book, are talking about his keeping his shoemaker equipment so near and never speaking of it. And Pross says, "Not knowing how he lost himself or how he recovered himself, he may never feel certain of losing himself again." And when Laurie asked, "Well, would it be good if we talked about it?" she said, "Touch that string and he instantly changes for the worse. Better leave it alone." So I wanted to explore how mental illness was viewed during this time period. So if you go to the next slide there. In general, those suffering mental illness were cared for at home by family. However, if a patient was indigent or couldn't afford to have a doctor to the house, or if they were so ill they couldn't be safely cared for at home, then they were admitted to a hospital. So I read this summer Benjamin Rush's biography by Stephen Freed, and I highly recommend it. He did major work. He is from Philadelphia. He did all his work in Philadelphia. He founded Dickinson College. You can read over there on the left all his different things. He was American revolutionary, a founding father, signed the Declaration of Independence, was a civic leader in Philadelphia when he was a physician, politician, social reformer, humanitarian, educator, and he founded Dickinson College. Um, he really is an amazing man. And in 1751, he was at a Pennsylvania hospital prior to his getting involved. The mentally ill were locked in cells in an unheated basement and chained to the floor where they lived on straw. They slept on straw. It was thought at that time that people who were mentally ill couldn't feel hot or cold. So they were often unclothed and just left alone no matter what the temperature because it didn't matter to them. Dr. Rush advocated for better treatment and got patients heated rooms with views of a garden. His own son, John, experienced mental illness after he killed his good friend in a duel. It was a duel over a Shakespeare play, which was kind of sad. And his son, John, like Minette, would spend hours pacing the floor and talking to himself, similar as you call Dr. Minette paces back and forth and Lucy walks with him. He walked such a straight line so often that he wore the floorboards down, and people who paid to come and look at people in this island would come and look at that. And it was called Rush's Walk, where his son paced back and forth. And he was not able to help his own son. His son spent the rest of his life in the asylum. So the novel starts in 1775, and Rush is in Philadelphia at that time doing pioneer work on mental illness. He was very interested in the theories of Dr. David Hartley, who studied the physiology of the brain and nerves to explain madness. Hartley was interested in the associative theory, which influenced Dickens. If you read about Dickens, he was very interested in David Hartley. And they talk about whether or not to destroy the bench for making shoes. It's due to its association with Minette's illness. And standard treatments at the time, if you're unaware, included bloodletting, purging, wine, bark, and mercury. Dr. Rush added his own ideas of less red meat, more vegetables, exercising, and not drinking spirituous liquor. The next slide, in France, just looking, I'm trying to sort of cover Philadelphia local, France, where the novel is taking place. Philippe Pinel was a French physician and also a zoologist. And he was instrumental in the development of a more humane psychological approach to the custody and care of psychiatric patients, referred to today as moral therapy. He published a memoir on madness in 1774. And he was the first one of the few people saying mental illness is treatable and can be cured. Patients need to have more ethical treatment. You need to speak with them and unchain them. And literally, when they chained them to the floor, they left them. And then just hopefully one day they'd feel better and say, "Oh, I'm good now. Unchain me and I'll be good," and to go home. Next slide. In England, coming up, this is Broadmoor Asylum in 1867, which is, as you can see, is a huge asylum in England, and both male and female patients were treated there. If you go to the next slide, it talked about where they were ample opportunity for them to make friends and have relationships. You can see this is the men's day room. The recreational activities were provided as part of the treatment in Victorian asylums. They encouraged patients to interact with one another. Some male patients played team sports such as cricket, and female patients would take group rides and walks around the asylum grounds. The asylum block had all day rooms where patients could play a variety of games where they could write, paint, sew, and read alongside each other with conversation. And the last slide here on this features Dr. Samuel Hitch, who is the founder of the Association of Medical Officers of Asylums and Hospitals of the Insane. And this is in England now. So this is where Dickens would have been familiar with the Lunacy Act of 1845. And the expansion of the asylum system following the County Asylums Act of 1808 and 1828 came the Lunatics Act of 1845. You can see we weren't much into sensitive terminology at this time with the Lunatics Act. It was associated with the emergence of medical doctors showing interest in the diagnostic, clinical, and legal aspects of the care of the insane. As medical knowledge about insanity expanded and medical legal involvement in court cases increased, doctors were working in this area to begin to demonstrate their expertise in the management and treatment of mentally ill people. And I think Holly mentioned last week thinking about maybe, what some of the problems of Sidney Carton might be. And he certainly also had problems. But Dr. Minette, and when we get back to our characters, I will talk a little bit more about how they handled that when we get to the chapter and opinion. But mental illness at the time, there was a huge strides made between 1775 and up to 1845, the Lunacy Act, and how people who were mentally ill were treated. And it's little wonder that people kept them home if they could and didn't say anything because of the way they were being treated. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Peter.
Okay, I like this guy Fred Bernard better than Fizz, because the characters seem so much more realistic. So this particular illustration occurs when let me read it and then it is frightful, monsieur. How can the women and the children draw water? Who can gossip of an evening under that shadow? The shadow struck across the church, across the mill, across the prison, seemed to strike across the earth, messieurs, to where the sky rests upon it. I thought that the depiction of the revolutionaries was particular, it just underlined their kind of, their poverty, and certainly, my God, the mender of the roads, look at him. I mean, with his wooden clogs and his torn clothing. And then there's Defarge, who's overlooking the scene. And I think that particular stance shows a kind of confidence and understanding of the character. And I think that we see that later with once we see Madame and Defarge in conversation. So that's it.
I just point out too, with this illustration you chose, Doc, that the character Defarge and the road mender illustrates the difference between the French middle class, which Defarge clearly was as a wine merchant, versus the peasant in dress and stature and position. And yet Defarge in France is going to embrace, at least to some degree, the violence of the revolution.
Yeah.
Jenny?
Yep. Okay. Now, our friend Jerry Cruncher, those of you who've been going along, we finally get a reveal here on what's happening with Jerry Cruncher. And we start out, this first picture you see here is called The Spy's Funeral. And if you recall, the funeral parade comes right by Tellson's, where he and his son are sitting outside the bank, and the world passes by them going left and right. And here comes this mob. And I want you to keep in mind as you watch this about the mobs. Dickens has an interesting, feeling sort of about mobs. And when you think of the mob at the wine cask, and then you look at this mob that is coming by with the spy's funeral. And it said, funerals had at all times a remarkable attraction for Mr. Cruncher. He always pricked up his senses and became excited when a funeral passed Tellson's. And then the next thing he said, as they went on, he followed this mob and all the things going on. We've got like a bear and all these things happening in this picture. Mr. Cruncher did not assist at the closing sports, but had remained behind in the churchyard to confer and condole with the undertakers. The place had a soothing influence on him. You don't hear many people being soothed by hanging out with the undertakers. So this spectacle of a large mob, and if you follow it, they go in a mob, they're yelling, spy, spy, with Roger Cly. And then after they get to the cemetery, then they all disappear again and vanish, just like with the wine cask, where there was this mob scene, and then they all sort of flowed back to where they belong. The same thing happened with this, a huge big mob. People were closing up their work. They were afraid anything could happen with the mob, and then they all vanished again. So this was quite the spectacle. Now, in the next slide here, we get to the Honest Tradesman, chapter 14, where they finally, of course, we reveal Mr. Cruncher and his friends here, as you can see on the left, digging up and prying open the coffin. And he starts out by saying, once again, he's at home with the aggrowaiter and worrying about her flopping and praying agin him. And he says, I'm a-going, as your mother knows, a-fishing. That's where I'm going to, going a-fishing. And of course, he doesn't want Jerry Jr. to know what he's up to. So as he goes, Jerry is following him, and he says, they were still fishing perseveringly when he peeped in at the gate for the second time. But now they seem to have gotten a bite. There was a screwing and complaining sound down below, and their bent fingers were strained as if by a weight. By slow degrees, the weight broke away the earth upon it and came to the surface. And so now we know he is a resurrectionist. He digs up coffins for dead bodies to sell to medical doctors. And of course, this is what his wife, the aggrowaiter, is praying, because this is not something she'd like her husband to be doing. I didn't put in here because it's a lengthy description, but I just loved on page 168, the description of Jerry Jr. When he sees what this is, he sprints for home as hard as he can go. And that coffin is following him the entire way. And it's sort of upright going along. And then it's laying down, trying to trip him up. And he is a mess on that way back home when he realizes what his father does. What I think is interesting, by the end of the chapter, they're on their way to work the next day. And Jerry asks his father, what's a resurrectionist? And he doesn't want to answer him. But he does. And he said, I think I'd like to be one, even though he sprinted home after this. So we now know this is his thing. He digs up dead bodies. And this is not the honest tradesman necessarily that his wife would like to have. So Kendall, if you want to jump in there with a little bit more about the resurrection men.
Yep. Fred Barnard again, loved this portrait of father and son. So the resurrection men is a real thing. It's old. The body snatching was an old profession. It dates back, actually predates the Renaissance, but we know for a fact that during the Renaissance, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and others dissected cadavers, and that's how they learned about the body, how it worked, and how to portray it. And if you look at enough of their artwork, you can just see how accurate they really were. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is by studying human anatomy. And of course, I should add to the Renaissance. I mean, they're all good Catholics, and if you dissected a body, you were expected to be damned and go to hell. So the fact that people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo were willing to jeopardize their souls shows you how thought was changing by the time of the Renaissance, and people were obviously moving away from some of the older teachings or traditional teachings of the church. In Great Britain specifically, you have in 1752 the Murder Act, and the Murder Act prevented murderers from being properly buried in sacred ground, and so in often cases, not all cases, but in many cases, a convicted murderer was publicly dissected so that the people could watch. You read enough Dickens, and you find out very quickly that Dickens, was abhorred by public spectacle, the hangings, the public dissections, although public dissection was pretty much gone by the time he was an adult. He was turned off by this, and certainly he saw this as the public spectacles as another evidence of the mob and what concerned him. But the Murder Act certainly shows that even if it's not, that resurrectionists had a job, and so rather than get public dissection, they would steal bodies before they were buried in pauper's grave or mass grave, as they usually were, and it was profitable. There were a number of gangs who profited from resurrection. The London Burkers was probably the most notorious and most successful, and they literally murdered people and then sold their bodies for profit. So it wasn't like they were just kind of victims of other crime. They were purposely identifying and killing people just so they could sell their bodies for profit. And that was 1831, and Dickens clearly knew about this because he's writing by now. And the Anatomy Act of 1832 legalized the use of workhouse corpses. So if you died in a workhouse, you could be sent off to a medical school. By now, medical schools were permitted to dissect legally, and there still were not enough bodies available for all these schools and artists, and so resurrectionists were still making plenty of money throughout the 1830s into the 1840s.
Before you move off that slide, I don't know if you noticed Karen McCurdy's comment.
I did not.
She writes The Knife Man by Wendy Moore in 2005, a novel about the father of modern surgery, John Hunter, 1728 to 1793. He used the talents of body snatching resurrection men. The study of anatomy was greatly advanced during this period in England. The Knife Man is a great read, especially for anyone interested in medicine.
Cool.
I stumbled upon this book years ago, and then when we were reading, and they talked about Resurrection Man, it drew me back to this. This John Hunter was, prior to the time, surgeons kind of just went in and dug around. Hunter and his brother first, really advanced the study of anatomy, and thereby improving surgery to a great extent. So it's an easy read, a lot of really interesting anecdotes in here, and just it ties in. It's slightly before this time, but like I said, the resurrection men were a real thing.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah,
I'll add into that in case you thought the United States was exempt from this. If you read the book, The Devil in the White City by Larson, about the Chicago World's Fair, the serial killer in that, who is a real person, was killing people to sell to medical colleges, and also disintegrating their bodies to sell articulated skeletons to medical schools. And this was going on right in the United States, right through the Chicago World's Fair. Women were disappearing left and right at his hands, and they were all being sold. He buried some of them, but they were being sold to medical schools and being used to make skeletons. So the United States was not some great place where this wasn't happening. This was over there in Europe. We were also taking part in that practice.
Well, the Mutter Museum probably has a lot of
No.
those skeletons.
Yes.
So.
I bet they do. They've got plenty.
That's an interesting place.
I've got a fun fact about
Go ahead.
resurrections too. I was doing a story years ago about Ben Franklin, and when he was an ambassador in London, they were renovating the home that he lived in there, and they found all these bones in the basement. And it turns out that Ben Franklin was hiding his medical friend, had like a secret medical school in the basement of Ben Franklin's home in London, and they found the bodies of 15 people.
Oh
So
my
he
God.
was letting them do dissections right there, and it was illegal at that point, but it was he was encouraging it. Anyway, if you
Wow.
go to London, go to the Ben Franklin house, and in the basement there's all the bones. It's amazing.
Wow. Didn't know
Add
that.
that to my
Very cool.
stops.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Jenny?
Yes. So back to my person Pross, Miss Pross, who turns up in these these two chapters of 9 Days and an Opinion. And I think it's interesting in this section of the book, we get that Miss Pross actually has a sense of humor. And she and Laurie, although a man of business, and he calls her a woman of business, they're getting some really witty repartee between them. So as the wedding comes up of Lucy, she goes, "I'm not crying," said Miss Pross. "You are." And they wax sentimentally over the silverware that he got for them, how lovely it was. And then he talks about, gosh, should he always have been a bachelor? And Miss Pross says, "Pooh," rejoined Miss Pross. "You were a bachelor in your cradle, and you were cut out for a bachelor," pursued Miss Pross, "before you were put in your cradle." Telling poor Laurie that he would have never been anything but a bachelor. But he was sort of saying that's kind of harsh because he thinks, that maybe he could have had a family, but he has certainly adopted Lucy and Dr. Manette and their children as his family. And then comes the chapter that ties into what I was talking about now with the mental illness. Lucy gets married. She leaves for her honeymoon. Of course, Manette has found out that Charles Darnay is the Evermom, which I think he really knew because several times earlier in the book, if you follow it, he tells him, he actually gets angry, makes faces back when the trial occurs, when he thinks he knows who he is. And he relapses, and the next thing you know, he's back making shoes. So Miss Pross says with a terrified face was at his ear, oh me, all is lost," cried she, wringing her hands. "What is to be told to Ladybird? He doesn't know me and is making shoes." So now Manette has relapsed. He's in his room. He's making shoes. And this goes on for 9 days. And they don't do anything but watch him, spend time with him, offering Laurie, of course, every night offers him, should we go for a walk? And he's not going for a walk. It's pretty scary. And at the end, after they go through an opinion where Laurie very cleverly talks to Dr. Manette about his illness, saying it's somebody else and tell me more about this, tries to get him to acknowledge that maybe it would be best if he got rid of that shoemaking bench and the shoemaking materials so he doesn't relapse. And he talks, Miss Pross, the two of them talk about it, and Pross and Laurie concur that the shoemaking stuff needs to be destroyed. And of course, Dr. Manette said, well, it'd be best if you were going to do this to this person, not to do it while they were there. And so when Manette leaves to join Lucy and Charles on their honeymoon for the second part, they sneak in, and here's the picture, the drawing you see there in the book. "So wicked do destruction and secrecy appear to honest minds that Mr. Laurie and Miss Pross, while engaged in the commission of their deed and in the removal of its traces, almost felt and almost looked like accomplices in a horrible crime." And so they chop up the shoemaking bench, they burn it, they bury the tools in the backyard. And I guess the first question I'd like to start with, to throw out to the group is, did Laurie and Pross do the right thing? Did they handle this the right way, in seeing Manette fall apart and sort of just sticking with him and then destroying his bench and everything to go with it? I'd be curious to what people think about that, whether or not you thought they did the right thing.
I think they did. I think they did an amazing job too, because they were there 24/7 monitoring them. They were taking turns and shifts. And They waited for him to show signs of readiness to join the human race again. And when they did, I'm amazed at how Mr. Laurie proceeded, because he was using techniques that are used now today for PTSD patients. And it's only been a couple decades since that was recognized as something to be treated. And you didn't just stuff the relative in the attic, which they did after World War I and World War II, because they didn't know what was going on or what to do with it. But anyway, so the therapy that's used a lot today is EMDR, where the patient talks about the different occurrences that led to the PTSD while following a stream of lights, which distracts the brain in part, so they're not feeling it as if it's happening to them in the moment, which is pretty much what Mr. Laurie did with Dr. Manette, as he's taking it from a viewpoint of another person with a similar situation to Dr. Manette, but a different profession. And so Dr. Panette, he's drawn in because that's what he did for a living. He would consult with people and diagnose what was wrong with them, and then give opinions on what could be done. So for him now, he's thinking, well, this is another case for me to diagnose. But Mr. Laurie's asking him the leading questions, which takes him through the process so that he can face his own fears, which he couldn't before. And that's what made him space out, because his brain would not allow him to actually deal with his former reality. But it was successful, and I applaud him for doing that in 1859. And it's amazing that that kind of technique wasn't even thought of for decades until later.
Terrific. Anybody else? Thoughts?
Hey, Jenny.
Yeah.
So the whole time I was reading that, every time I've read the book, I was saying, holy moly, you know, doesn't Manette realize who Laurie is talking about? It's like, come on. I mean, I was just like, so, it's like, yeah, okay, Dickens, you got to do a little bit better than this. And again, it was, I like to point out what I find as just unrealistic or weaknesses in the plot. So anyway.
So I think, to answer that, I think that he does know it's him.
Yeah.
And as Holly said, he's looking to sort of distract him. And Laurie, not wanting to hurt anybody's feelings, like, he's the nicest, kindest person in his book, and he doesn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So he's not going to straight up say, look, you spent 9 days in a zone here making shoes. What's wrong with you? Should we get rid of this thing? He's going to try to be as nice as he can. So by phrasing it as, I have a friend. I mean, it's just like the classic way everybody solves their problem. I have a friend who has this problem, and could you help me with it? So he could talk about it without, he knows it's him. I mean, I think as you follow the book along, he knows all along. If you remember when Charles told him he wanted to marry Lucy, and he said, I have something to tell you. And he put his hand right over his mouth, like, stop, don't say it, fingers in my ears, don't talk. I know you're an Evremond, and I don't want to hear it, because I know I'm going to relapse and it's going to drive me nuts. So I think he does know, and Laurie's looking for the kindest way to help him out.
I agree with you. I think he does know. There are just some responses that he gives. I just look one really quickly. When he's asking about if how when he's not in his relapse, and he's studying all this stuff, and he says, oh, do you think he's under too much strain? He says, I think I'm quite sure of it. That's what his response is. And different responses like that. I'm pretty sure he's fine, that was just a one-time thing. And then also when he says, make sure you get rid of that thing when he's not there. Because I think if he saw that being taken away, he was thinking maybe it would cause him some anxiety and cause him to relapse. I think, though, that they should have just hidden it away somewhere, because like he said, that was his one comfort. It kept his mind occupied, or his fingers occupied, so his mind wasn't dwelling on what was going on there. So I think they should have hid it away, because he very well could relapse again. And then what are they going to do? Have this madman who has nothing to do now. And why did he relapse? Is that because Lucy went away? And that was like, I don't really remember. Maybe there was why he was put away in the first place. But he was taken from his family, and that probably caused him such great despair. And then Lucy went away and he relapsed.
He relapsed when Charles told him, that he was an Evremond, which he let him know right before the wedding. And we don't want to have any plot spoilers, so because we will find out in the last section of the book why he, what his situation was that ended him up in prison and him losing his mind. But his losing his mind was tied into what Dickens learned at Eastern State Penitentiary, that about 10 years in, this treatment method they had that they thought would cause people to reform actually drove them insane, and they were making shoes and things like that really affected them. The other thing I just came to me that I meant to mention, because Kendall mentioned at the very beginning about knitting, and I don't know if you remember the section, and I didn't jot down the page number, but not only Dr. Manette making shoes to keep his mind from thinking about what upset him, but there's a paragraph too where the women are knitting constantly to keep their minds from thinking about the fact that they have no food, nothing to eat, their children are starving, and they knit and knit and knit to take their minds off what the horribleness of their lives are. And so that associative idea of trying to take your mind away from something else with a different task is repeated more than once during this novel.
They do also say that they throw it in there that they say it's for your daughter's sake also, when they're going to break up the bench and do all that. And I think that was a heartstring that definitely sort of like put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, to say, yeah, maybe you're right, for Lucy, let's do this. By the way, it's also World Mental Health Day, just in case anybody, I think that's kind of interesting today.
That's something I should have known. Good job, Derek. Thanks.
More questions?
I was gonna say I could throw out another question from my segment about Cruncher. Either one, were people surprised that all this whole thing we've been alluding to since practically the first page of the book was that he was a resurrectionist? And is it an honorable trade? Is it great that he digs up bodies for money to help doctors? And should his wife be upset about it or not? And he puts money and food on the table with it too.
Well, she's really religious. We talked about that earlier in the class. At the top of the class, Kendall was talking about it. So clearly she's not into people digging up the holy remains and doing whatever you will with it. I think probably a lot of medicine was misunderstood or not understood fully at that point either. So people were thinking it was the devil's work to be digging bodies up after they were buried, especially if you were super religious like Cruncher's wife is.
Yeah, at the time this novel was published, that the medical profession, although it's becoming more of a profession and it is being studied in a scholarly fashion, it's still looked down upon by many. I mean, they were still bleeding people, profusely when Dickens is writing this novel. So
I think it's a pretty clever profession. Realistically, like aside from the religious aspect, he's not hurting anyone by doing it. He puts food on his table, he saves his own family. He's kind of disrespectful to the dead, but they're dead already. So they don't, whether they mind or not.
Yeah, but the families might mind because they didn't give their consent.
Only if they know. And so he kind of skirts it by dodging it. He's like, nobody knows. He goes in the night and he keeps the living alive.
He is, though, such a jerk.
Oh, yeah.
It's like it's hard to to commend the profession when you have a guy who's pretty much of a class A abuser.
I think he gets sort of super excited about when the spy is being taken to the graveyard, because I think, to the point that I just heard Amanda kind of make, he wasn't really going after the good guys. In his mind, he's saying, well, I'm digging these guys up because they're bad guys anyway. So that's all the more better for me to feel better about it and dig these guys up.
Plus, he made an observation that the guy was kind of on the young side, so he might bring a higher price to a doctor.
It's also interesting how his wife, or how he's always, thinking his wife is, cursing him and whatnot. So he probably has it on his conscience that he's doing something not great. But he does it anyway.
I think it's important to point out that his
Unfortunately.
wife does mention when he says to her, why would you pray against me? And why do you not support me and all this? And she said, you weren't doing this when we got married. So I didn't know this was your trade. She's like, now that I know you do this, I better be praying because I'm not happy about it. But he makes it like, this is, you married me for better or worse. And this is me, live with it.
Yeah, I have a question about some of the imagery that you use talking about the dirty hands. So in the scene with Laurie and Dr. Monet, I think one of the ways that we know that they both realize they're talking about about Dr. Monet is that he keeps looking down at his hands during the conversation, which I think is him kind of acknowledging that it's Laurie's talking about him. But it just occurs to me that he has the dirty hands, and then Cruncher has the rusty hands, and it seems like there's some paralleling going on there. But I can't quite, I'm not sure where that's going. Does anybody have any thoughts about the hands?
I know he spends a lot of time talking about that rust on his fingers. He mentions that more than once and speaks of rust with the dead. And I'm trying to figure out where the rust is, whether the rust is from the crowbar, from the coffin nails. But he's always talking about how, there's rust on their fingers. And I think that does tie to, Matt's hands also being, dirty from, a trade working at something.
And then again, I guess, Dr. Monet is the one who's been resurrected, right? The man
Right.
coming back to life, buried alive.
His wife is especially aggravated, I think, because their son is being apprenticed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
And kind of apprenticed to be the jerk that you said he is.
Yeah.
Right? He's mean
Yeah.
to his mother. He's not even nice to her.
Right. They also mentioned that when he sits outside of Tellson's, looks for children that are younger than he is, so he can smack them around, when he's bored sitting out there. But it's interesting how his father, when he tries, if you remember when the spy's funeral went by, little Jerry Jr. went, "Hurrah, father, hurrah, it's a funeral." And he smacks him in the head and says, "What are you hurrahing about?" It's sort of interesting that he goes on him about this and doesn't really want him to be thinking about being a resurrectionist.
It's funny when you mentioned the rust, Ginny. I think that for me, I think of like the wine's red, the blood's red, rust is red. It's more of that symbology, I think, there, right? I mean,
yeah. Good point.
I'm going to throw out a question. So this is kind of combining a couple of the ones that I made up, but I'd like to go to this is, partly for Becca and for some of my former female students here, but the question about how does Dickens embrace and challenge the Victorian notion of the angel in the house through his characterizations of women. And obviously we got, Mrs. Cruncher, the poor thing, but we also have Lucy and Madame Defarge. Okay, so the angel in the house, by the way, is a long and pretty awful poem by Coventry Patmore, in which he glorifies his wife as the angel in the house, who is passive, does everything that a wife should do in the Victorian times, and it just goes on really forever. I don't know that I've ever read all of it, but anyway, how do you assess Dickens' characterization of these two women, and why does it matter?
Well, if you're going to call me in by name, Peter, I have to say something. I will confess, I find Dickens' angelic women excruciatingly boring. This may be an unpopular opinion, but I'm not a Lucy Manette fan. I think she is a blank slate, super vanilla. Men write anything they want onto her, and she is just so good. I know I've read some biographies of Dickens in which you see that like he had this relationship with his wife's sister, with various other younger women that he idealized and made into these perfect angel women. And almost every book he writes has one. There's always a perfect angel woman that he, you know, ensconces and doesn't really bother fleshing out much. So I think that's, you know, that aside, I think what's interesting is the discourses that men write onto her. You know, the early part of the reading was all about the various marriage proposals that were intended or needed to happen. And while Lucy herself, we don't see a lot of her reaction, we see what she means to Carton. We see what she would mean to Stryver. My favorite line in the whole Stryver section, and my page numbers are slightly different, but I love when he says, she's a charming creature and I have made up my mind to please myself. On the whole, I think I can afford to please myself. She will have in me a man pretty well off and a rapidly rising man and a man of some distinction. And it is a piece of good fortune for her, but she is worthy of good fortune. So I just, you know, they write themselves onto her. And even Charles Darnay, who does clearly love her, writes himself onto her as the salvation that he can connect with something good and something pure and something maybe of the imprisoned element that was imprisoned because of his family or something like that. So I feel like they're all, you know, she is Manette's redemption. I feel like they're all writing themselves onto her and she is a blank slate upon which the men create their own characters. That's my thinking.
Does she grow at all?
I think she does when she's talking to Carton, when he's busy unburdening all his feelings on her. I think she handles it very well, and with compassion and a depth that I didn't expect. I would have expected her to be frightened by all that, but no, she's stepped up to the plate and made him feel good while rejecting him.
And then I think further on the heels of that, Holly, is when Darnay comes in to speak to Lucy and starts talking poorly and badly about Sydney. And she's like, no, you've got to give this a different viewpoint. You've got to put yourself in his shoes or what have you.
I also think in this tale of, you know, two things in the beginning, all the contrast, I think Lucy is like your New Testament, all forgiveness, and Madame Defarge is your Old Testament, all vengeance, an eye for an eye. And it's part of that is to draw that contrast between the two of them being so far apart in the types of people they are, which becomes, you know, even more so as you continue on in the book. But that Lucy seems to forgive everybody and wants not to think ill of anyone. And Madame Defarge is putting everybody's name in that knitting. Everybody's gone down in her book.
So if you have Lucy on one side and Defarge on the other, where does Miss Pross fit in?
I was just going to say, I think Lucy is the only angel in the house type character that he's portrayed here. Every other woman, I feel like, is sticking up for themselves, has something to say, has their own agenda, their own thoughts, their own ideas.
Yeah, but Mrs. Cruncher she's so passive. I mean, don't you think? I mean, I think she tries to be an angel in the house, but the guy just beats her up.
Yeah, I think all the women kind of they don't have any action. They may express themselves, but I don't think they would ever actually do anything. They'd prefer the men to do the action for them.
You may change your mind on that a little later. But
I was just saying, I'm not sure
I'm
I
keeping
agree
my
with
mouth
that.
closed.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that even now where we are in the reading. I think that while Lucy is frequently just, you know, love and affection and forgiveness, I think we've seen Miss Pross already push back on Laurie, already involve herself actively in the supervision of Manette while he's relapsing. We've seen Madame Defarge, she is the record keeper. Like there's that moment where Monsieur Defarge says like, no, it's all safe with my wife. My wife has it all. We don't need codes because she's got it all. So in some ways, the entire revolution rests in her knitting. And, you know, when she puts that rose in her hat, everybody leaves the shop. Like she is pretty active in interesting ways. So I think actually it's just Lucy that I kind of find treacly and but I'm interested in the other women in this novel. I think they're kind of part of their
even
I love it. Go ahead.
even Mrs. Cruncher is, you know, all that action is because she is sticking up for herself a little bit for this viewpoint that he shouldn't be digging up bodies, right?
Yeah.
She keeps sticking it to him on that a little bit.
So what do we do with Madame Defarge? You know, is she just, you know, kind of, you know, to what extent is she sort of roundish as a character versus Lucy, who I would say is pretty flattish as a character, though she shows, you know, a little bit more substance as time goes on. So is Madame Defarge just sort of like a caricature, or do you see some depth in her? Because it's kind of important. I mean, she's kind of the symbol of the revolution, right?
I think she's the chief antagonist. I haven't continued reading, but I saw her as the leader and her husband as subordinate to her. She stayed up until she was done. She was the, you know, spy master whose actions, she was extracting information from the spy. She was subtly getting the people out of the shop, as someone else mentioned. She's going to be her knitting is such an interesting counterpoint to the other women of France who knit to forget. She knits to remember and to lead a
excellent
battle cry.
Excellent. You got a table slap for that.
She got 2 table slaps.
It's taken me like 20 years, but it means so much to me.
Well, I never gave table slaps for good things. Mine were always bad. So this
Yeah, I
is
got
new
some
for
of
me.
those too.
That was excellent, Beth.
I'm very excited to see where it goes because she's my favorite character so far.
Oh, mine too. Other comments about you know, how is she working in the novel? How does she work?
She's super secret. She's a spy. I mean, she's the antagonist, and you can, I mean, if you finish the book or not, she's I forget the word I want to use, but you know, she's doing this, but she could be the flip side of a dark world that they're fighting for. World can flip to her being super evil.
I also just think it's an interesting portrait of the role of the woman in this time period, that she's maybe not overtly leading things, but is very much within the spaces that she's allowed to inhabit being a leader. And so very different than some of the, I don't want to say all the women are female characters are passive, but perhaps they're not leading their destinies in quite the same way as she is.
She's very much a leader of the rebellion.
The marriage between the two has me puzzled because they don't seem like they would be compatible, but they are. You don't see any crosswords or any tension between them. And it's kind of like the husband is the visionary and the strategist and maybe the tactician, but she's all about literally the execution. So he's involved in the higher theory of the revolution, and she's planning how she and others are going to carry it out.
And you're not going to have one without the other.
Right.
Yeah.
She's doing what she can within the confines of her society. Whereas Lucy is the idealized, well, it's pre-Victorian. I mean, it's written in the Victorian age. She's the ideal woman, but Madame Defarge is truly the strongest, and she's probably somewhat the most manipulative. I mean, they're working. Her intent is the one that's being fulfilled in the end.
And she has a job too.
Well, she also pushes her husband. They
Yeah.
have a conversation about like, how long does it take a lightning storm to build? And how long does it take an earthquake to come? And she says to him, but when it is ready, it takes place and it grinds to pieces everything before it. And she says, that is your consolation. Keep it. She's like, no, it's going to happen and it's going to be epic. And you need to keep this in mind. And he says, my brave wife, I do not question all this. So it's like an inverse of the Cruncher relationship. Like she's the one who's like, let me give you the wisdom. And he goes, yep, you're absolutely right. So she does actually remind him to stay on task, to stay on purpose, to see it out, to finish it. So I do think she pushes him in interesting ways.
And he admires her. He admires him. He calls her a great woman. You know, she will. I'm looking for the quote where she's sort of saying, "Well, you know, time will tell. Time will," because he's very sympathetic. He's, oh, I hope Charles Darnay, you know, doesn't get
doesn't come over.
yeah, because this is bad. But she says, oh my gosh. Anybody know what I'm talking about?
She's going with the Doris
He's on there
days.
for
Que
good
sera,
reason.
sera. She says, what will be, like whatever.
Right.
You know, he says, I hope he doesn't come. And she says, you know, whatever happens will happen.
Yeah.
191. Bottom 191.
Excellent. Okay, her husband, her husband's destiny, said Madame Defarge, with her usual composure, will take him where he is to go, and will lead him to the end, that is to end him. That is all I know. God, I just love that line. I mean, she's just, you know, I mean, she's not a sympathetic soul, obviously, but there's that she will make the revolution work. You know, at least that's, you know, the feeling that you're getting it. My God, everybody is fearful of her. Everybody is respectful of her. There's this kind of admiration. And, you know, it's kind of, she's a member of the middle class too, which I think is kind of cool because, you know, it's doubtful that Lucy ever, you know, worked a day in her life.
Yeah, but Lucy's a step above where.
Oh, I know in society.
Madame Defarge is, yeah. I
know, but the point is that her middle class background, to me, gives makes her, you know, a sympathetic. Like I wouldn't even call her the antagonist.
We have time for one more question, but I'm going to defend Lucy here because Lucy plays a role, and yeah, she isn't as interesting. No argument there, but she's representative of quite a few middle class women in a very accurate way, whether we like them or not. Just throwing that out there. Doc, one more question.
Yeah. All right. Well, back to a scene that Ginny mentioned, because this doesn't require a very, you know, long answer. But why? You know, there are a lot of moments where you're sort of wondering, or I'm wondering, like, okay, so why is this whole business about Stryver, you know, wanting to woo Lucy if he's actually capable of being a wooer? But another one that comes to mind is the mock funeral. Why is it there? You know, other than presenting some important stuff about Jerry Cruncher. Why is it there? Why do you think it's there?
I'm going to go with there's nothing in Dickens that doesn't have a reason.
All right. So what's the reason?
We may not know it yet, but we will.
Well,
very, very true.
I love that about his books. That if there's a character you met on page 3, there's a reason they're there, and they're going to turn up before you get to page 500.
So if you look at page 162, at the description, I mean, I'll just read some of it. the top, these the people tore to pieces and scattered far and wide with great enjoyment, while the tradesmen hurriedly shut up the shops. For a crowd in those times stopped at nothing, and was a monster much dreaded. They had already got the length of opening the hearse to take the coffin out, when some brighter genius proposed instead its being escorted to its destination amidst general rejoicing. Then farther down, the remodeled procession started with the chimney sweep driving the hearse, advised by the regular driver who was perched beside him under close inspection for the purpose, and with a pieman also attended by his cabinet minister driving the mourning coach. A bear leader, a popular street character of the time, was impressed as an additional ornament before the cavalcade had gone far down the Strand, and his bear, who was black and very mangy, gave quite an undertaking air to that part of the procession in which he walked. So we've got total chaos.
You could look at this in two ways. One, there's some comic relief in in what you're looking at, and two, there's a lot of uneasiness to see how easy it is for mobs to form and grow unruly and have chaos happen. But this was a disorganized mob. But what happens when there is an organized mob? That's the kind of thing that leads to revolutions.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when a volcano puffs a little and people get upset, but it dies down, and then at some other time it'll blow. You just don't know when.
Yeah, that's great.
And the same thing with the Stryver situation. That's some comic relief there. I had a smile the whole time. It was very amusing. But also, he is the only character who doesn't worship Lucy. So it's interesting to see that he doesn't see her as the angel that everybody else does. She would just be an appendage that he could be munificent to.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, she would benefit from being married to him.
She'd be so lucky to have him. So lucky. How could she be so stupid?
Lee has a theory that I'm making him share. Yeah, you have to share.
Come on, Lee, say something.
No,
Come on, Lee.
All right. Well, what I keep thinking it's a tale of two cities, and I keep looking for doublets and twins and things like that. So what I'm looking at is, and I don't want to take issue with what Kendall said, but
you can.
I don't think of the Defarges as middle class, even though they own a wine shop. To me, they've identified with the lower class. They've embraced the lower class. So I'm thinking of the Defarges as lower class versus people like Pross and Laurie. What I'm thinking is the lower classes in England are for comic effect, and the lower classes in France are for terror. And I think what's missing is this middle class that Dickens was, and that he seems to celebrate. And you get the middle class sort of mitigates the terror of the lower classes. And in France, you don't have a middle class because they've all run away to England. The teacher and the doctor, who I think in that time would be considered a middle class, the teacher and the doctor are all expats. So I think what you've got is a juxtaposition of sort of frightening lower class in France and humorous lower class in England with Cruncher, and I think that's the mitigating aspect is the middle class, which England seems to have and to celebrate, and France is missing right now. It's gone.
You're spot on. You're not disagreeing with me at all. I mean, absolutely. And we can elaborate on that more, but that's a table slap, Lee. Congratulations.
Did you hear it? I'll give you another one, Dan. All right, there it is.
This is great. I'd love to go on, but I'm not sure.
One more thing, because that answer was, I love that answer analysis, which brought me back to your, there was second or third slide, Kendall, of why England didn't have revolution like France was another, I think it was like 5 bullets or 4 bullets, was another, or could a final bullet be because all the crazies went to the USA? I mean, right? Like, last few months, I finished that book, Fantasyland, and it's interesting how he discusses, you know, all the radical religions that came to the U.S., all people who wanted to, like, it was interesting reading it. And your slide, I was like, well, wait a second, you would have had revolution if all these people are still in England. I mean, I don't know.
No, there's absolutely there's truth to what you're saying. We were a pressure valve too. I think more so in India and Asia, but for the radical thinking, no, you're yeah. We were a dumping ground of sorts.
Yeah, it's a good plug for that book, Fantasyland, because it's interesting of how he scripts like the founding of us and everybody who kept coming and moving to Maine and down and south, and it's cool.
Who wrote that?
Fantasyland. It was Kevin something, I think. He wrote 2 books, that and and Evil Geniuses, 2 really good books that are very insightful. Fantasyland and Evil Geniuses. Yeah. 2 really good books for his people like history.
It is, and then we got to go. I'm getting Disneyland.
Kurt Anderson.
Kurt Anderson. Thank you, Derek.
There it is. Yeah.
Can I
we're
just
gonna
add something? Different. I just found it interesting. Those 3 proposals. Charles went to the dad. Stryver went to Lori, and then Carton went right to Lucy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Your daughter did a great job on your hair, by the way.
Oh my God.
I don't think it's ever been so shiny.
You were definitely shimmering a little bit there.
Yeah. I wish I had some.
This was a great conversation, and there'll be more time next week, and then again our last session will be mostly just discussion. So keep it up. This is great. This is the most participation I think we've ever had. We got a good group here. Thanks for joining. Stay tuned for the next set of questions, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.